From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Monica Norton. I'm the Deputy Local Editor for the Washington Post, a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. This is the 15th year that the Library of Congress has hosted this event. To keep up with the times, if you feel so inclined and you desire to tweet, we ask you to use the hashtag NatBookFest15. And I should also mention that there's now an app for all your book festival needs, and it can be found at loc.gov/apps. I have the pleasure of introducing Bryan Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. He is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, which provides legal services to those who can least afford it and those who frequently have been harmed and not helped by the law. Last spring, a piece by 60 Minutes, ostensibly on TED Talks, led off with the TED Talk given by Mr. Stevenson, noting his work in helping men and women, and all too frequently children who have been imprisoned and given sentences that many times were beyond excessive. They talked about how his TED Talk has been viewed more than 2 million times. Born in Delaware, Mr. Stevenson is a graduate of Eastern University, Harvard Law School, and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. As impressive as his credentials are, his work, which is detailed in the book, are even more so. Just Mercy illuminates how unequal justice can be. You can read about what happened to Walter McMillan, a man falsely imprisoned on death row for 6 years. And somehow Dr. King's quote about how the arc of the moral universe is long but bends towards justice cuts a little bit more deeply. But as one review noted, just as anger and heartbreak looks like it may take over, Mr. Stevenson's own words save you. He writes, simply punishing the broken, walking away from them, or hiding from them only ensures that they remain broken, and we do too. There is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bryan Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. It's a great, great thrill to be part of this wonderful book festival. I absolutely have enjoyed the day enormously. I've met some of my famous authors and had the opportunity to meet many of you, and I'm really thrilled about that. I wrote this book, Just Mercy, because I'm persuaded that if more people saw what I see on a regular basis, they would want this country to change. They would demand that this country change. Because we've become a nation that has become comfortable with some things, some conditions, some abuse, some mistreatment that I don't believe we ought to be comfortable with. We're a very different country than we were 40 years ago. In 1972, we had a prison population of 300,000. Today, we have a prison population of 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. There are some 70 million Americans that have criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a job or try to get a loan, they're going to be disfavored. The Bureau of Justice now reports that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century, that wasn't true in the 19th century, that didn't become true until the 21st century. The number of women who've been sent to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years. And these conditions have created problems where you see abuse, you see suffering, you see extreme indifference to great challenges to the human condition. And so I wanted to write about that because I'm persuaded, really, that we can only change the world if we think more intensely about some dynamics. I could talk about the issues, and I don't really want to do that. I could even talk about some of the characters, but I'm not just interested in doing that. I'm interested in talking about how we as a community change the world. I wrote this book in hopes that people would not simply finish the book, but finish the book and join us in trying to do something to create greater hope, greater justice. And I think there are 4 things that we can all think about doing. The first is proximity. I am persuaded that we cannot change the world until we get proximate, until we get close to the things we care about. And whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's poverty, whether it's the environment, whether it's the way certain people are treated or mistreated, I am persuaded that proximity is essential to how we cope, how we do better. When you get proximate, when you get intimate to the problems you care most deeply about, you see things that you can't see from a distance. You hear things that you can't hear from a distance. There are nuances that you pick up. And I'm persuaded without an understanding of these nuances, we don't come up with the right solutions. We've got policymakers, we've got politicians. This city is filled with all kinds of policymakers and politicians. And oftentimes the solutions they are proposing are ineffective because they are too distant from the problems that they are trying to solve. I learned a lot about proximity as a kid growing up. I grew up in a community where I could not go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. And lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public school. And because of that intervention, I got to go to high school and I got to go to college. No one in my family had gone to college before. Had a great experience in college. I went to school in Pennsylvania to college. I was very active in sports. I was very active in music. I was studying philosophy, and I'll be honest, when I was in college, I was having the time of my life. I thought college was great. I didn't ever want college to end. And I would sometimes say to my friends, you know, I'm going out on the hillside. I was a philosophy major. I'd say to my friends, I'm going to go out on the hillside. I'm going to do some philosophy. And my friends would look at me kind of hard, and I realize now that they thought I was saying I was going to do drugs or something crazy like that. But I wasn't. I would go out there and I would just sit and think these deep thoughts. And I was saying that one day, and I went out on the hillside and I was thinking what I thought were these great deep thoughts. And one of my friends came up to me and said, well, what are you going to do after you graduate from college? I was a senior. And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized for the first time that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated. And so I frantically started looking for graduate education opportunities. And I realized, which I didn't know, all of you know this, I didn't know, that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or political science or English, you actually have to know something about history, political science, or English. That was pretty intimidating to me, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It's pretty clear. It was clear to me then, and still clear to me now, that you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that, and I found myself at Harvard Law School. And 2 months into my first year at Harvard Law School, I was sitting in the classroom and just looking around, contemplating the fact that I had made a terrible mistake. Because I went to law school to deal with racial bias, and I wanted to talk about poverty, and I wanted to do something about inequality and injustice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or poverty or justice. It was disconnected. And then I went to Georgia to work with a human rights organization that was providing legal services to people on death row, and it was this proximity that changed things for me. I went to death row to tell a man that he wasn't at risk of execution anytime in the next year, and when I got there, I was so overwhelmed at the fact that I was just a law student. I didn't know very much. When he walked into the room, I couldn't get the words together. I just started apologizing. And then when I finally got to the point where I could say to him, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year, this man did something I've never forgotten. He grabbed my hands. He told me thank you over and over again. And we started talking. We had this unbelievable conversation that went for 3 hours. I'd only scheduled to be there for 1 hour. And the guards were angry because I was still talking to this man after 3 hours, and they finally just bursted into the room and started treating him very roughly. They threw him against the wall. They put handcuffs on his wrists, they put the shackles on his ankles, they put the chain around his waist, and they were treating him so roughly. I tried to get them to stop, but they were ignoring me. I felt guilty, I felt bad that I'd gotten him in trouble, and I said, look, it's my fault, not his, but they ignored me. And they kept pushing him, and I could see him grimacing in pain as they put these handcuffs on. And I kept saying, please, please be gentler, but the man said, don't worry about this, Bryan, you just come back. They started pushing him toward the door, and he almost fell when they tried to push him out of the room. And I tried to get them to be calmer, but they were ignoring me. He said to me again, he said, Bryan, don't you worry about this, you just come back. And then just before they were going to push him out the room, I watched this man do something I've never forgotten. He planted his feet on the floor. And when they tried to push him this last time, he didn't move. And then this man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't you worry about this, you just come back. And then he did something I've never forgotten. He closed his eyes, he threw his head back, and he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn I hadn't heard in a long time. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. There was something about that moment that changed me. The guards recovered. They started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could still hear him singing about higher ground. All of a sudden, I knew that I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. It radically changed my interest in the law. I went back to Harvard Law School, and you couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about constitutional law and criminal law and civil procedure and criminal procedure and substantive due process and procedural due process. It changed my relationship to being a lawyer. And proximity will do that. It will do things to you, not just for you. You will learn all the nuances and details you need to kind of figure out before you can be a problem solver. But more than that, you'll learn something about what you can achieve as a human being. We have a world filled with inequality and suffering. People who have been abused, people who are suffering from disability and illness. And too often it's their distance from the rest of us that adds to that sense of despair. And we have to get proximate, I am persuaded, if we're going to create a greater nation, a stronger nation, a nation where there is more justice. The second thing I think we have to do is that we have to change the narrative. I am persuaded that we cannot confront the problems we care most deeply about until we deal with the narratives that sustain those problems. And mass incarceration and excessive punishment in this country have been sustained by a narrative. There's been the politics of fear and anger that I believe have made mass incarceration inevitable. For the last 40 years, all of our politicians have been competing with each other over who can be the toughest on crime. And when you create a narrative where everybody's operating through the lens of fear and anger, you will see abuse. Fear and anger are very dangerous components to policymaking, to a national consciousness. Any place in the world where we want to look at abuse and oppression and violation of basic fundamental human rights, you'll see that there's a narrative of fear and anger being exercised by those who are perpetrating these violations against those who are victimized. And fear and anger is a narrative that we have to change. I've been representing children in the last 10 or 15 years. My clients have gotten younger and younger, and one of the things that I write about in the book is the way in which we have done something I think quite horrific to children in this country. We've started demonizing and criminalizing children, and there's a narrative behind that. In the 1980s, there were criminologists that started arguing that some children aren't children. They made the argument that these kids may look like kids, may sound like kids, may act like kids, but they're not kids. They came up with a new word for them. They characterized this new generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. They said, these aren't children, these are super predators. And they used that word to characterize this demographic of child. And every state in the country, including the District of Columbia, reacted. We lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. The district made it possible for 13-year-old children to be prosecuted as adults. Most states eliminated the barriers between adult and juvenile processes, and we sent thousands and thousands of kids into the adult prison system. Today, there are 250,000 people serving long prison sentences for crimes they were accused of when they were children. There are some 3,000 children in this country that have been condemned to die in prison. 15 states, no minimum age. I was working on a case some years ago involving a little boy who was 14 who ended up in jail. In this case, this boy lived in a house where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. And some days, this boy's mother had a boyfriend, and the boyfriend would start drinking, and when the man started drinking, he'd get violent. And the boy's mother had been drinking one day, and he came in, the boy's mother's boyfriend had been drinking one day, and one day this man came into the house, and he didn't say anything. He just called the boy's mother into the kitchen, and he punched her in the face. She fell on the floor, and she hit her head as she fell, and she was bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running in there to help her, this 14-year-old child, and he couldn't get his mom to wake up. She was covered with blood. She wouldn't respond no matter what he said or did. And after a few minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. And so this little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man was sleeping. And he walked over to a dresser drawer where he knew this man kept a handgun. And he opened up the dresser drawer and he pulled that gun out. And he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he stood there and pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this little boy tragically pulled the trigger. He shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. Now, this little boy was very small for his age. He was about 5 feet tall. He weighed under 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He had no prior juvenile arrests, no prior juvenile adjudications. He was the kind of child that might have been tried as an adult, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult, and they immediately certified him to stand trial as an adult and put him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother called me, and I went to the jail to talk to this little boy, and I got there, and I started asking him my questions, and he wouldn't say anything. He was a really small kid, under 5 feet tall, weighed less than 100 pounds, and I kept trying to ask him questions, but he wouldn't say anything. After a few minutes, I got up, and I said, "Look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me." And he just kept staring at the wall. I walked around the table, I pulled my chair close to him, I said, "Come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me." Wouldn't say a thing. I couldn't figure out what to do, and at some point I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, I felt him lean back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him. I said, "Come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me." And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man. This little boy started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night several people had raped him. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there so many people had hurt him he couldn't remember how many there had been, and I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I said, "I'm going to get you out of here," and I tried to go across the street to the courthouse to get an order to get him out of there, but when I tried to leave, this little boy grabbed me by the arm and he said, "Please don't go." Never will forget it. I said, "No, I'm going to be right back. Please don't worry. I'm going to be right back." And I left that jail. And the question I had in my mind is, who is responsible for this? And I realized the answer is we are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge in this country that condemns some children before they have a chance. We've actually allowed this idea that some children are super predators. I believe that all children are children. And if we don't change the narrative, if we don't recognize that even the children who have fallen down, even the traumatized children living in parts of the cities where they're born into violent families, they live in violent households, they go to violent schools, they're chased by violent gangs, even those children, if we do not recognize that those children are children, if we don't change the narrative, then we will abuse them. We will contribute to the narratives of unjust, unequal, unfair treatment. The narrative has to change. I think we have to change the narrative about race in this country. I think this country has gone too long in silence about the way we have all been infected by our history of racial inequality. We've all been burdened by this history. We've all been compromised by this history. We don't have to do very much to create tension or conflict. We don't trust one another. We have inherited this problem, and we've been silent about the problem we've inherited, and the problem persists. I think we need to change the narrative. I think we have to talk about some things. I think we need to talk about slavery in America. I don't think we've ever dealt with the legacy of slavery. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I don't believe that we actually dealt with this. You see, I think the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference we created to justify slavery. It was the ideology of white supremacy, this notion that these black people we are enslaving are not really people. That was the true evil of American slavery. There were societies all over the world that had slavery. In most of those societies, slavery was transitional. It was not tied to some race or to some ethnicity. But in America, we created a system of slavery that was permanent, that was hereditary, and tied toward race. And that narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white supremacy, that wasn't addressed in the 13th Amendment. We didn't talk about that when we passed the Emancipation Proclamation. We just carried on, and that's why I argue that slavery didn't really end in 1865. I believe it just evolved. It turned into another era where that narrative manifested itself, and for decades, we lynched and terrorized people of color in this country. I live and work in Montgomery, Alabama, and the land is soaked with the blood of people who were lynched and murdered. More than that, we created a demographic geography around race that we've never really acknowledged. You see, at the beginning of the 20th century, 90-some% of the black population lived in the Deep South.
Many of the black people who came to DC and New York and Chicago and Baltimore and Boston, and certainly most of the black people who went to Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit, in Los Angeles, Oakland, did not come to these communities as immigrants looking for new opportunities. They came to these communities in the 20th century as refugees from terror. They were fleeing terrorism and violence. And if you know anything about the needs of refugees, you know that you have to deal with the trauma that these communities bring with them, or there will be generational problems, and we haven't owned up to that. Older people come up to me sometimes and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get so angry when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched every day of our lives. Even as we deal with the civil rights movement, I think we've got to change the narrative. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement and it just sounds so celebratory. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, as we should. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, as we should. We're celebrating the March on Washington, but we're not talking about what gave rise to this conflict. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we just changed all the laws. And if that was our history, I mean, we'd be a great country, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades in this country, we humiliated black people. We burdened and battered and excluded. We told people of color, you're not good enough to vote. You're not smart enough to go to school. We injured and belittled and humiliated. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives, every time they saw the signs that said white and colored. And we haven't talked about what that legacy has created. And now we're living at this time where we can talk about the Bureau of Justice saying that 1 in 3 black male children is expected to go to jail or prison, and it's not a national crisis. I think we need truth and reconciliation in this country. I think we have to commit ourselves to a process of truth and reconciliation. In South Africa, there was a recognition that after apartheid, there would not be progress without truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, there's a recognition that they won't recover from the genocide without truth and reconciliation. In Germany, there's been a commitment to telling the truth about the Holocaust. You can't go 100 meters in Berlin without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed at the home of a family that was abducted during the Holocaust. They want you to go to the concentration camps in Germany and reflect soberly on the legacy of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice, people are looking for exits. We haven't even learned the vocabulary to talk about this history, and I think we've got to change that narrative. And I think that that's true not just for people of color, I think it's true for all of us. I believe there's freedom on the other side of this narrative. I actually think we can get someplace in this country where we're less burdened, where we're less battered, but we cannot get there until we change the narrative. I want to put markers and monuments at every lynching site in this country. I want the spaces where there was the slave trade active and manifest to be recognized. I want us to deal more honestly with the legacy of segregation. And more than that, I want to create a world where we really do value the victimization of every human being, but that can't happen until we change the narrative. Third thing, I don't think it's enough just to be proximate and to change the narrative. I absolutely am persuaded that we cannot create a better world. I couldn't write this book. I couldn't do the kind of work I do unless I held on and protected my hope. Hope is critical. Without hope, we will tolerate things that are unjust. I am absolutely persuaded that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I go into schools sometimes and I see a hopeless teacher and a hopeless principal and hopeless kids, and I know there won't be good education. I go into courtrooms where I see a hopeless prosecutor and a hopeless judge and a hopeless defense attorney, and I know there won't be justice. Hopelessness is the enemy that we have to prepare ourselves to fight against. Havel talked about this. Havel said the kind of hope you need to change the world isn't a preference for optimism over pessimism. Havel says the kind of hope you need to change the world is an orientation of the spirit, a willingness to position yourself in hopeless places and sometimes be a witness. I told this story in my book about the wrongful conviction of Walter McMillan. And he was a man who was living in a community where there was a great deal of unfairness. And it took hopefulness to get people to confront that injustice. And I'm persuaded that's what we need. And you know, we have to kind of protect ourselves because there are things that will make you hopeless that may not make me hopeless. And you've got to be mindful of the things that challenge you, because if you're mindful, you'll be a little better at preparing yourselves. I will tell you that living in Alabama, what provokes me, what pushes me, what challenges my hopefulness sometimes more than other things is the way in which we try to romanticize our past, the way we glorify the Old South, the way we talk about our history. And I'll be honest, living in Montgomery, it's a difficult thing. I don't like the Confederate flags. I don't like it when people start talking about the good old days. I don't like the way we try to minimize the pain and anguish that we created through slavery and terrorism. In my state of Alabama, Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. In Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. In Alabama, we don't even have Martin Luther King Day. It's Martin Luther King/Robert E. Lee Day. And this narrative, in my view, is challenging. And I was going to a prison not too long ago to kind of to meet someone I hadn't met before, and I got to the prison. There was a truck outside the prison, and this truck was like a shrine to the Old South. It had the gun rack, it had all of these Confederate flags on it, it had the bumper stickers. There was actually a bumper sticker on this truck I'd never seen before. This bumper sticker read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." Hadn't seen that one before. And I went to the door of this prison, and I got there, and there was a white guard there. And when I got there, I said, "Hi, my name is Bryan Stevenson. I'm the lawyer. I'm here to go do a legal visit." And the man immediately said to me, he said, "You're not a lawyer." I said, "Well, yes, sir, I am. I'm an attorney." He said, "Where's your bar card?" And I was insulted because I'd never had to show my bar card before. I said, "Look, I don't have to show my bar card." He said, "I don't believe you're a lawyer." He made me go back to my car and get my bar card. I came back to the prison. I showed him my bar card. I was insulted. I said, "Look, I want to see my client now." And then he said, "Well, you're going to have to still get in that bathroom, and I'm going to give you a strip search." I said, "No, sir. Lawyers don't get strip search coming into this prison." He said, "You're coming into my prison. You're going to get in that bathroom. I'm going to give you a strip search." I tried to get someone to help me, but no one would, and I had to make this terrible decision. And I decided, because I'd driven 2 hours, to just go ahead and get through this. And I subjected myself to a humiliating strip search. Came back out, said, "Look, I want to see my client now." He said, "No, you've got to go back there and sign the book." I said, "Lawyers don't have to sign that book." He said, "You're coming into my prison, you go back there and sign the book." And so I did, and finally the man took me to the door, and he unlocked the door. And I was about to walk inside, and he grabbed me by the arm. He said, wait, let me ask you something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Did you see that truck out there with all those flags and bumper stickers?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that truck." He said, "I want you to know that that's my truck." Really provoked me. And I was sitting in the room just trying to get my head together. I hadn't met this client before, and then finally they opened the door, and the young client came in, a young African-American man, and he came in and he sat down. And the first thing this client said to me was, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" And I thought to myself, this is the strangest day I've had in a really long time. I said, "No, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to represent you." And I started asking my questions, but I realized he wasn't paying attention. And I put my pen down, and I realized he was hung up on this milkshake. I said, "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't know you wanted me to bring you a chocolate milkshake. The next time I come, if they let me, I'll bring you a chocolate milkshake." And this man smiled and smiled and smiled. He was severely mentally disabled. Horrific abuse. Had been in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10 years old. At the age of 13, he began showing symptoms of bipolar disorder. He couldn't get the medicine he needed, and so he started using crack cocaine. By the age of 15, he was using heroin. At 16, he was showing symptoms of schizophrenia. At 17, he was homeless. At 18, he began having psychotic episodes. At 19, in the midst of a psychotic episode, this man committed a terrible crime and stabbed someone to death. He was immediately arrested, charged with capital murder, taken to trial, convicted, and sentenced to death. I got the record and went through the trial transcripts. The trial lasted a day and a half. I couldn't find the words mental illness, mental disease, mental disability anywhere in that record. Terribly defended. One of the great challenges we have in this country right now is that we have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. There's never been a time in our history where we've had more innocent people in jails and prisons than right now. We began working on this man's case. I got some great experts involved, and I was feeling hopeful because they were giving such terrific insight and input into what had happened. And it was time to go to court, and I had all of my experts lined up. I had the witnesses lined up, and we went to the courthouse a couple of hours from the prison. And when I got to the courthouse, I explained to my client what was going to happen. I had to explain to him first that I couldn't bring him a milkshake. That was always my little ritual. But then I said, "We're going to put on some evidence." And he said, "Okay." And I turned around to get ready to start, and who did I see in the corner of the courtroom but that guard, just glaring at me. I hadn't seen that guy since that first encounter with him, but he was the officer that had brought this man to the courthouse. Well, I decided not to let him distract me. We put on our case over the next 3 days. I felt good about it. The experts were doing well. The judge was paying attention. I was feeling hopeful that maybe we could get this man some relief. And after 3 days in court, a month went by, and I decided to go back and see my client at the prison. So I drove down to go meet this man after the hearing, just to talk with him and make sure he's okay. I parked my car. I was about to walk into the prison. I was walking into the prison, and lo and behold, what did I see in the parking lot but that truck? Hadn't had to deal with that guard at the prison since the first encounter, and I saw that truck, and I just started thinking, you know what? I don't feel like dealing with this today. I don't need to be put through all of this today. I'm just going to come back another day. And I actually turned around to go back to my car, and that's when I started hearing that song they used to hear, they used to sing when I was a little boy during the Civil Rights era. They used to sing this song, "Can't let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around." And all of a sudden I realized I wasn't supposed to turn around. I said, you know, you got to go deal with this guy. So I got my bar card, and I said, you know, I'm just going to go through this. And I went up, and sure enough, the guard was standing at the door. I said, hi, I'm here for a legal visit. And before I could say another thing, the guard stopped me, and he said, hello, Mr. Stevenson, how are you? Through me. I said, I'm fine. I said, I'll go in the bathroom and get ready for your search. He said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we're not going to do that today. I said, well, thank you. I said, I'll go over here and sign the book. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming, and I signed you in. Could not figure out what was going on. I said, well, thank you. He said, yes, sir. And he turned to take me to the door, and I was trying to figure out what was happening. And we got in front of the door that he had to unlock to let me into the visitation room, except when he got in front of the door, his hand started shaking so badly he could not get the key in the lock. And I was standing there watching him while he was trying to unlock the door, but his hands were shaking so badly. Finally, after a few minutes, he got the key in the lock. He unlocked the door, and he turned to me, and he looked up at me, and his face was bright red. And then he said to me, Mr. Stevenson, I've got to say something to you. I said, what's that? He said, well, I want you to know, sir, that I was in that courtroom during that hearing, and I was listening. Then he said, I've been thinking about this. I've been actually thinking about this a lot, and I just have to say something to you. He said, I want you to know that I think what you're doing is a good thing. He says, I hope you keep fighting for justice. Blew me away. I said, thank you. He said, no, sir, I mean that. He says, I came up in the foster care system too, had it really bad. He said, I didn't think anybody had it as bad as I did, but I realized, listening in that courtroom, that maybe your client had it worse than I did. And then he said, I realized some other things. He said, I realized I'm a really angry person, been angry my whole life. He said, but I realized that what you're trying to do, that's a good thing. And then he said, I hope you keep fighting for justice. And he said, I want to shake your hand. And he put his hand out. And I shook his hand. I said, you know, it means a lot to me that you've said that. Can't tell you how much it means. Thank you. And I turned to go into the prison, and he grabbed me by the arm. He said, wait, I got to tell you something else. I said, what's that? He said, well, I want you to know I did something on the way back from the courthouse. I said, what'd you do? So on the way back from the courthouse to the prison, I decided to take an exit. And I took your client to a Wendy's, and I bought him a chocolate milkshake. It's a really silly story, but it speaks to me about how important it is that we stay hopeful. When I hear people saying, well, those people will never be this, and these people can't do that, and these people can't be this, and this section can't do that, it worries me that we need to have people who are prepared to be hopeful in the face of that hopelessness. Hope is what will get you to stand up when somebody else is saying, sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people are saying, be quiet. Hope is necessary if we are going to create greater justice. Fourth and finally, and I wish I could stop at 3, but I can't. It's not enough to be proximate. It's not enough to change the narrative. It's not enough to be hopeful. The fourth and final thing I think we have to do, that I hope comes through this book I've written, is that ultimately, if we want to change the world, if we want to create greater justice, we have to also be willing to do uncomfortable things. And that's hard. Human beings are programmed to do what's comfortable. We love comfort. I love comfort. I'm not speaking against comfort. But sometimes we have to do uncomfortable things. We cannot get to a better place. When I look at the history of the world where I've seen justice grow and break through, where there's been change, where we've made a step toward equality, it's only happened when people do uncomfortable things. The path to justice is not a path that can be defined by only doing what's comfortable and convenient. And I know how hard it is to do uncomfortable things. And I'm not saying you have to do them all the time, but I do believe you have to do them. Look, we're built to seek comfort. I get it. I like comfort. I'm not against comfort. I was giving a talk down in Mississippi, and I flew down there, and I got off at the airport, and the people met me. They said, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of person you are. We know what kind of work you do. We know what kind of things you're about. And we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we've decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. We've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn. I said, what is wrong with you? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you've got to position yourself to do uncomfortable things. I was giving a talk in a church a few years back, and there was an older man who came into the back of the church, and he was sitting in a wheelchair. And this older man kept staring at me, and he looked angry. He had this very intense, almost angry look on his face. He was actually distracting me. I was trying to get through my talk, but he kept staring at me with such intensity. I got through the talk. People came up. They were very nice at the end of the talk, but this man kept staring, and he had this very angry look on his face. And he got a little boy to wheel him up to me in the middle of that church. He came down the middle of that church aisle with this very stern, angry look on his face, and he got in front of me. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up, and he said, do you know what you're doing? And I just stood there. And he asked me again, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I stepped back and I started mumbling something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me one last time, he said, do you know what you're doing? And then he said, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And this older man looked at me, he says, you're beating the drum for justice. And I was so moved and so relieved, you know. He says, you're beating the drum for justice. And then he said, you keep beating the drum for justice. And it blew me away. He said, come here, come here, come here. And he grabbed me by my jacket. He pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, I'm going to show you something. And this older man turned his head. He said, you see the scar I have behind my right ear? He said, I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck? He said, I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote. He said, I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, people look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. I said, but I'm going to tell you something. He said, these aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. And when you do the uncomfortable thing, there is something on the other side of that that feels honorable, that feels just. I really do believe we need a country that embraces more justice, more mercy, more compassion. My clients have taught me really simple things. I've been representing people on death row, people in jails and prisons, but they've taught me that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. I don't believe that for any human being. I don't believe any of us is just our worst act. I think if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And the other things people are just as important as the worst act they've committed. I don't believe in this country that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I think we talk too much about money in America. I am persuaded that in this country that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I believe that the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit ourselves to more justice, that's when we deconstruct poverty. And the 50 million poor people in this country have a chance at actually becoming full Americans. And finally, I believe that we can't judge how we're doing in Washington, in New York, in Chicago, in Alabama, in Mississippi, Georgia, or anywhere in this country, but just looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. We are preoccupied with the treatment of the affluent and the celebrated. And I want to push us against it because we really have to judge our character, our commitment to the rule of law, our civility, not by looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and privileged. We have to judge how we're doing in this country by looking at how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. There is in this space the great opportunity of getting proximate, of changing narratives, of being hopeful, of doing uncomfortable things. I've had lots of people tell me, I wasn't terribly comfortable reading your book. And I can't say that I can apologize for that. One of the great powers of literature is that it opens up the world. I am really privileged to be in a space where there's so many people who love books. When I was a little boy, the public library was not open to black kids. My family was very poor. My mother went into debt so that she could borrow and buy the encyclopedia, World Book Encyclopedia. And books took me places I never expected to go. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved, and she had this way of bringing me into this world of literature, even though she had never gotten to go to school. And so I'm excited about what books can do. I'm excited that a book festival brings together people like you with people like me, but mostly I'm excited because I hope there are people in this space that are going to look for opportunities to get proximate to the things you care about. They're going to think about how we change the narrative about the issues that are most dividing us and burdening us. That you will be hopeful about ending mass incarceration and unfair punishment, and finally, that you'll choose to do uncomfortable things when those uncomfortable things will create more mercy, more compassion, more justice. I'm so excited and privileged to have had this opportunity, and I want to wish you all the very, very best. Thank you very much. So I've been told that we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, and there are microphones at the front, so please, if you have a question, come forward. Yes, please.
My question is, how can we make a donation to the organization that you represent?
Wow. First of all, let me first say, I don't know you, but I love you.
I love you too.
Oh, thank you. The organization is called the Equal Justice Initiative, and if you go to our website, eji.org, we would love your donations, and I appreciate that question. We are actively trying to do a program that is about changing the narrative. We produce calendars that talk about racial history. We have a report on lynching. We have a report on slavery. We really do have a project where we're trying to mark the spaces in this country where lynchings took place, and your support and donations would absolutely help us advance that. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I was raised in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And I didn't really understand slavery until I read the book, Slavery by Another Name.
Yeah.
And I was very angry and upset when I finished it because our history does not reflect when slavery really ended here in the United States. It didn't end until the 40s. And when I talk to people about the book I read, they look at me like I'm telling a lie. I said, no, they just called it something else. Yeah. And two questions. How can we get our history books to acknowledge the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery, which is what we are taught?
Right.
I'd like you to answer that. And also, were you able to help that child that killed his mother's abuser?
Yeah. So on your first question, I absolutely agree. Doug Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, terrific work to expose the problems of convict leasing, which continued into the 1940s. Yes. And I do think there are tools. I do think it's going to require some pushing. Because to kind of tell the true story of our history means that we're going to have to do some uncomfortable things. We're going to have to relate differently to the problems that have emerged in our society. We have some tools. I really recommend that you get the calendar that we produce because it's a daily effort at trying to change that narrative, and I really hope that that can have an impact. But we need more of the kind of groundbreaking writing that Doug Blackman does in that book. Isabel Wilkerson does it in The Warmth of Other Suns, talking about the Great Migration, a fantastic book. There's some other books like that. The little boy, as I write about in the book, was somebody I was able to get out of that facility pretty quickly. An amazing family got involved in his life and adopted him. And I'm proud to report that just recently he's finished college, he's recently gotten married, he's actually doing really, really well. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Stevenson. I am a law student, and I'm interested in helping people in my law career who have been wrongfully convicted. I was wondering if you could tell me what your advice is about what the role is for future students who are looking to follow in your steps.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I think what I would say to you and what I'd say to anybody is that, you have to hold on to the things you're passionate about. I tell my students and my staff that we can't change the world. We can't create greater justice with just the ideas in our mind. I want all the young law students and lawyers that I work with to be smart, tactical, informed. I think you should put as much in your head as you possibly can. But I'm persuaded that we can't create justice in this country with just the ideas in our mind. I think we have to allow the ideas in our mind to be fueled by some conviction in your heart. And so what I care most about is that you protect what's in your heart, what motivated you to be a lawyer. Read your law school admission essay over and over again. Don't let law school separate you from the things that motivated you to want to use that power to change the world. And if you do that, and get proximate, and change narratives, and stay hopeful, and do some uncomfortable things, I have great hope that we can create a more hopeful future. I'm sorry my time is up. I really wish I had more time. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.